She never blinked. Not once during the funeral. Not even when the coffin lid closed over her husband's face. Not even when the cannons fired their last salute. And not even when they told her, quietly, almost mercifully, that the empire was no more. Her eyes remained fixed, open, unmoving, unyielding, as if she could hold back history itself by simply refusing to look away. They called her Zita, the last Empress of Austria, the final sovereign consort of a dying world, the woman who carried an empire's corpse on her shoulders and pretended it could still breathe. But history wasn't kind to women who defied gravity. And Zita's world? It crumbled beneath her feet. Palace by palace, ally by ally, son by son. They told her to leave quietly. She did not. They asked her to accept exile. She refused. They begged her to surrender hope. She answered only with silence and eyes that never blinked. Because in her mind, Zita was still empress, even when she was starving, even when she was hiding in the woods of Belgium, even when she was buried under 17 years of mourning, even when she went blind. She still looked at thrones that no longer existed, at crowns that had long since rusted, at a world that had forgotten her. And yet, she never blinked. The story of Empress Zita is not one of war. It is not a tale of battles won or treaties signed. It is not even a story of power lost. It is the story of a woman who became history's widow and chose to marry the memory instead of letting it go. It begins not in Vienna, not in Rome, but in a convent, with prayers, with ink-stained fingers, with a little girl who learned early that silence was a weapon, and pain was a kind of loyalty. Zita of Bourbon-Parma was born into royalty, but not the kind that ruled, the kind that wandered, the kind that clung to ancient names like fading perfumes. She was raised among whispers of what her family had lost and what Europe could still owe them. And when she met the man who would become Emperor Charles I, she saw not a husband. She saw a mission. This is the story of a queen who never ruled, a throne she never sat on, a crown she carried not on her head, but in her mind, until that mind began to crack. This is the story of faith so blind it devoured reason, of dignity so rigid it became delusion, of hope so fierce it tore through grief, motherhood, and exile, and left nothing but a woman staring into the abyss and never blinking. Why did she never let go? Why did she walk through 4 countries on foot with 7 children and still act like she held the imperial scepter? Why did she bury her husband twice and still sign her letters as Her Majesty the Empress of Austria-Hungary? Why did she demand her sons reclaim a world that no longer wanted them? Was it love? Loyalty? Madness? Or was it something far more terrifying? The inability to live without being needed by an empire that had stopped needing her? In this documentary, we will not show you battles. We will not tell you of victories. We will show you a slow erosion of a mind, of a memory, of a monarchy, until nothing was left but a woman in black, frozen, unblinking, and forgotten, but not gone. Because even now, in her photographs, in her exile letters, in the stories told by old men in forgotten alpine towns, Zita's eyes are still watching. She was born in exile, but she didn't know it yet. On 9th of May, 1892, in the quiet town of Pianore, Tuscany, far from the crowns and courts of Europe. Zita Maria delle Grazie, Adelgonda Michaela, Raffaella, Gabriella Giuseppina, Antonia Luisa Agnese came into the world. 17th of 24 children, a daughter of the House of Bourbon-Parma, a dynasty once royal, now mostly ceremonial. By the time Zita was born, her family had already been dethroned and displaced, their duchy swallowed by Italy's unification. They still carried their titles, Duke of Parma, Duchess of Piacenza, but no one paid them tribute anymore. Only the ghosts of old Europe bowed. She grew up in a house filled with relics, old maps, old portraits, old rules, and older grief. Her father, Robert I, Duke of Parma, had once ruled a small but proud state. He had lost it in 1859 when Zita was still unborn. And yet, every room she stepped into echoed with that loss. Her mother, Infanta Maria Antonia of Portugal, was royalty too, exiled from her own homeland after Portugal's monarchy collapsed. Together, they raised their children not as citizens of any one country, but as heirs of a broken idea. That monarchy, even when erased, still mattered. In the sprawling Villa Pianore, the Bourbon-Parma children lived almost like monastics. Strict Catholic discipline, Latin lessons, hours of prayer. They spoke French, Italian, German, and later Spanish, because royalty must understand many tongues, even if they have no throne to speak from. Zita, unlike her sisters, did not chatter. She watched, listened, absorbed. She learned early that women in exile were not supposed to speak too loudly. Their power lay in stillness, in waiting, in silence. And yet, silence was not passivity. At age 10, she was sent to a Franciscan convent in Zandberg, Upper Bavaria. Not because her parents were cruel, but because royal girls needed shaping. Not for freedom, but for sacrifice. The nuns taught her obedience, but Zita taught herself something more dangerous: conviction. Even as a child, she showed a frightening clarity. She fasted not out of duty, but defiance. She gave up sweets, not to please the sisters, but to test her own will. Her faith was not soft, it was forged, like a blade. There was one thing that softened her: music. Zita played the piano with intensity. She once said music helped her speak without betraying. And gardens. She loved to walk barefoot in the gardens of the villa at Pianore. Among roses, jasmine, and olive trees, she could pretend the world hadn't fallen apart. These were her brief windows of light. A scent, a note, a barefoot memory, then back to silence. In 1907, at age 15, she entered the Institut Religieux de Saint-Adrien in Belgium. This was not a typical finishing school. Here, noble daughters were groomed for one of three destinies: the veil, the court, or exile. Zita chose none, or perhaps she chose all. She read theology, politics, philosophy, more than was expected of a Bourbon-Parma girl. She was curious, sharp, but always guarded. She never questioned monarchy. She questioned the world that rejected it. It was in Belgium she met Archduke Charles of Austria. He wasn't yet emperor, not yet heir, just a solemn young man with heavy eyes and a strange destiny. He visited the convent with his aunt, Archduchess Maria Theresa, a close friend of Zita's mother. They walked the halls politely. Charles noticed Zita, not for her beauty, but for her silence. They spoke briefly, He asked if she believed monarchies had a future. She answered simply, "Only if they remember they serve God first and power second." He never forgot it. Their paths crossed again 2 years later, this time in Switzerland, at a family gathering in Lucerne. They sat beside each other at a dinner. Charles, shy, devout, awkward. Zita, composed, observant, unyielding. They talked about politics, the church, the crumbling alliance between Austrians and Hungarians. Not a typical flirtation, but by the end of that week, Charles had made up his mind. "If I must bear the burden of the crown," he reportedly told his confidants, "then I want her beside me, because she believes in it more than I do." Zita was 18 when he proposed. She did not say yes immediately. She asked one question: "Will you promise me we will never put ambition above conscience?" He nodded. She accepted. And thus, a girl raised for silence became the voice behind a crumbling empire. The wedding took place on 21st October 1911 in Schwarzau Castle, Austria. The guest list was imperial, but the future was anything but secure. Within 5 years, they would rule a dying empire. Within 10, they would lose it. Within 15, Charles would be dead. And Zita? She would become a queen without a country, a widow without a grave. But on that day, surrounded by candles, violins, and vows, she smiled, and for the first and perhaps only time in her life, she blinked. She smiled for the photographs. Always. Even as the empire collapsed beneath her feet. Even as men plotted in shadows, and soldiers died in fields she would never walk. Even as her husband, Emperor Charles, became a crown in name but not in power. Zita smiled. But behind that smile, something had already begun to splinter. Not just around her, inside her. Because when you marry a man chosen by destiny, you don't get a husband. You get a symbol. And Zita had been trained, taught to serve symbols, to defend them, to endure for them. But no one had told her what to do when the symbol started to bleed. In June 1914, just 3 years after their wedding, the world began to burn. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Charles's uncle and heir presumptive, changed everything. Suddenly, Charles was no longer a quiet royal tucked away from consequence. He became the next in line to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Zita's life changed overnight. Security, ceremony, protocol. She was no longer just his wife. She was the empress-to-be. And yet, she didn't tremble. She prepared. Zita was not decorative. She did not wait quietly in parlors or hide behind drapes. She entered war councils. She read military reports. She demanded access to encrypted telegrams and daily intelligence. She believed in the monarchy, not as tradition, but as mission. And she would not let it fail without a fight. When Emperor Franz Joseph died in November 1916, the crown fell to Charles. At age 29, he became Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, and ruler of one of the most fractured, exhausted empires in Europe. Zita, by his side, became Empress Consort, and within days she began advising him on matters of state. To many at court, this was alarming. A woman, foreign-born, young, sharp, whispering in the emperor's ear. They called her ambitious. They called her controlling. Some called her dangerous. But Charles never silenced her. He needed her, because Zita understood what he did not. that an empire of 11 nationalities and dozens of clashing ambitions could not survive World War I intact. She urged him to seek peace, not out of weakness, but out of realism. And in 1917, without fanfare, without military aid, without the knowledge of Germany, Charles and Zita attempted a secret peace negotiation with the Allies through Zita's brother, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, who served in the Belgian army. It was called the Sixtus Affair. A desperate letter, an unofficial promise, a hope to end the bloodshed without humiliation. But the letter leaked. When Germany learned of it in April 1918, they were outraged. Austria-Hungary's loyalty was now in question. Charles was humiliated. Zita was blamed. And something inside her began to calcify. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She turned colder, sharper. She began to speak less in public. Her voice behind closed doors, however, grew firmer. She no longer smiled as often, not even to the cameras. And yet, the few times she did, it was almost worse, because the smile remained perfect, but the light behind it had vanished. Zita was pregnant during much of the war. She bore 8 children between 1912 and 1922, a staggering fact considering the times. And yet, she never once used motherhood as an excuse to retreat. She visited field hospitals. She wrote letters to widows. She toured factories where women made boots for men who would never return home. To the people, she projected strength. To the court, she embodied severity. But to her closest aides, those who dressed her, brushed her hair, and sat with her during silent evenings, Zita showed the first signs of something darker. She began to speak aloud to herself, not in confusion, but in what she claimed were preparations. She believed, even in 1918, that a miracle would save the empire, that one of the crowned heads of Europe would rise in defense of monarchy, that the people, starving, shell-shocked, and radicalized, would still choose tradition over revolution. And when no one did, when the walls of Vienna began to echo with the chants of Republican mobs, Zita began to sleep fully dressed. She told her chambermaid, "A queen should never be caught unprepared, no matter the hour of history." When the empire finally fell in November 1918, it was not with fire, not even with blood. It fell with papers, with treaties, with quiet signatures. Charles was forced to renounce participation in state affairs. Though he never formally abdicated, Zita urged him not to. "A throne is not a hat you put on and take off," she told him. "It is an altar." It was not metaphor. She meant it. And so they left. The imperial family was sent into exile. First to Switzerland, then Madeira. Zita packed the family's few remaining valuables. She carried the imperial seal in her purse. She made her children recite the Habsburg lineage every morning. And she told each of them, softly, lovingly, but without compromise, "You are not exiles. You are sovereigns in waiting." But behind her words, her smile cracked further. She began to wake in the middle of the night, pacing the floors. She wrote letters not just to monarchists, but to monarchies that no longer existed. She refused to wear mourning black, even after so many deaths. She wore imperial colors, always, even as her world shrank to rented villas and borrowed titles. Because Zita did not believe the empire had fallen. She believed it was merely waiting. Like her, the empire was gone. But Zita still woke at dawn, as if court would be assembled by mid-morning. She still arranged her children's clothes according to imperial protocol. She still prayed in Latin. She still read the diplomatic bulletins, annotated them, and folded them into silence, as if any of it still mattered. Because to her, it did. To her, it was not over. It was simply suspended. Like breath before confession. Like a curtain between acts. In March 1919, the family was officially banished from Austria. Stripped of citizenship, barred from returning. The people had spoken. But Zita did not listen. She called it a temporary misunderstanding. She told the children they would be back by Christmas. She whispered to Charles that God never forgets his own. They took refuge in Switzerland, renting a modest villa near Lake Geneva. But even in exile, Zita refused to dress like an exile. She wore pearls. She demanded etiquette at meals. She made her son stand when she entered the room. She had lost her crown, but not her image. And she would not mourn a world that, according to her, still existed in God's plan. Charles, on the other hand, began to break. He no longer believed in return. He grew quiet, withdrawn. He stopped correcting the children when they called him Majesty. He stopped answering the letters of royalists. He prayed more, but spoke less. Zita noticed, and she fought it. Because if he broke, the entire illusion shattered. And Zita could not live in a world where the illusion was false. She needed him to believe. She needed someone to believe. So she pushed him. She arranged secret meetings with loyal monarchists in Hungary. She reached out to the Vatican. She composed messages in code, always signing them Z. And in March 1921, against all odds, Charles returned to Hungary in disguise to reclaim his throne. It failed. Of course it failed. Hungary was ruled by Regent Miklos Horthy, a man who did not want a Habsburg king. Charles was stopped, turned back, and warned never to return. But Zita urged him to try again. That same October, he returned, this time with her by his side. She dressed plainly, carried no jewelry, but brought 7 of their children and a suitcase full of letters from monarchists. It was not a coup. It was a procession, a delusion in motion. They reached Sofron, waited for support. It never came. Horthy refused to yield. Troops surrounded the area. Negotiations failed. The dream, the second return, collapsed. Zita and Charles were arrested. No violence, just shame. They were exiled again, but this time not to Switzerland. This time to the Portuguese island of Madeira. An exile designed not to punish the body, but to starve the soul. Madeira was windswept and cold. There was no palace, no court, no money. Just a rented house with no heating and a leaky roof. They lived on charity from monarchists. Royal dignity reduced to handouts. Zita washed the children's clothes herself. Boiled potatoes over coal. But even here, she maintained the rituals. The children still prayed in Latin, still bowed before their father, still recited their imperial lineage every Sunday. Because Zita would rather freeze in royalty than be warm in reality. Charles, however, began to deteriorate. His health declined. He developed bronchitis, then pneumonia. He coughed blood. His skin turned waxen. Zita sat by his side, refusing to sleep. She read scripture. She sang softly. She whispered that their return would still come. And when the fever surged and he began to drift, She held his hand and said, "The empire is only asleep, my love. Not dead. Never dead." He died on the 1st April 1922, at just 34 years old. The final emperor of Austria. The last Habsburg monarch, dead in exile, in rented sheets, with no throne, no subjects, only his wife. Zita did not cry, not in front of anyone. She sat beside his body for hours, unmoving. When the doctors came to prepare the corpse, she whispered, "Do not touch the emperor without gloves." She kissed his forehead, then stood, and from that moment forward, she wore black every day for 67 more years. After his death, Zita refused to call herself a widow. She called herself Her Imperial Majesty, Empress Zita. She signed every letter that way. She told the children to address her the same. She told her eldest son, Otto, that he was now Kaiser, even though there was no empire, no crown, no people. They were moved again. Madeira was no longer safe. Zita was now considered a political threat by several European powers. So she fled, again. To Spain, then Belgium, and eventually Luxembourg, where distant relatives took them in. Each house smaller than the last, each year colder than the one before, each memory louder than the world around her. She began to keep to herself, rarely spoke in public, avoided mirrors, avoided windows. Some said she had begun to see things, that she spoke to Charles in her sleep, that she once asked a guest if they'd seen the throne in the hallway. But she was not mad, not yet, only broken, quietly, precisely, with imperial discipline. She dressed in black, not for a week, not for a year, but for the rest of her life. Not a thread of color touched her body again. Not a single jewel adorned her fingers. She refused makeup, refused celebration, refused even the scent of perfume. Because mourning, for Zita, was not a season. It was a strategy, a statement, a throne she could still sit upon, even if only in grief. They called her the Black Empress, not just for her clothes, but for the way she moved, the way she stared, the way she passed through rooms like an omen. And still, she did not cry. Not once, not publicly, not when they lowered Charles into the tomb in Madeira, not when the telegrams stopped arriving, not when her children asked her, in trembling voices, "Are we still royal?" She answered, "We are what God says we are, and God does not change his decrees." But something inside her was changing. It did not collapse. It unraveled. Slowly, invisibly. It began with repetition. She reread old letters aloud, murmured Charles's speeches in her sleep, walked the same garden path, back and forth, for hours. At first her staff thought it was part of prayer, then they weren't so sure. She insisted the children keep to imperial routine, even when living in borrowed guest houses, even when war loomed again, even when Otto begged her, "Mother, please, we are not in Schönbrunn Palace anymore." She stared through him and replied, "Then we must behave as if we are, because that is how empires return, through memory." Otto became the beacon, the golden heir. She poured every ounce of broken hope into him, tutored him personally, chose his instructors, supervised his speeches, criticized his handwriting, not as a mother, but as an empress. And he, loyal, brilliant, burdened, endured it, because he understood. She was not trying to shape a boy. She was trying to resurrect a dynasty. In moments of quiet, however, her hands shook. She began to forget small things. Names, dates, rooms she had just entered. She lit candles for Charles every night. Sometimes she lit 2. Sometimes she forgot and lit 7. She claimed the flickering made him speak clearer. And yet, every morning, she rose before sunrise, opened the curtains, and said aloud, "Good morning, Your Majesty." No one else was in the room, but not all was gray. There were glimmers. In Belgium, where they lived in relative peace through the late 1920s, Zita took walks with her younger children near the Abbey of St. Maurice. There, she laughed once, truly laughed, at a goat that stole her scarf and refused to give it back. The children were stunned. So was she. She picked a white rose that day, pressed it in her prayer book. "Even exiles are allowed one blossom," she whispered. That page was never turned again. She clung to the church, not just as a believer, but as the last institution that still called her Your Majesty. She corresponded with popes, attended Mass daily, taught her daughters the Psalms by heart. She refused secular literature, said novels were for those who forgot their purpose. Zita did not forget. She lived inside her purpose even when it had no place in the world, even when the world changed beyond recognition. Then came the second fire. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. The Anschluss. Zita, then in Belgium, watched her homeland fall into darkness again, this time under a different flag. With no throne left to reclaim, the Habsburg name was erased from state documents, their properties confiscated, their monuments defaced. Zita said nothing for 3 days. Then she locked herself in her room. She wrote letters to no one, tore them up, wrote again. When she emerged, she told Otto, "Now you see why we must never stop believing." He nodded, but she didn't notice the tears in his eyes, because he believed in her more than he believed in the crown. War came again. In 1940, Germany invaded Belgium. The family fled, on foot, by train, by borrowed carriages, through France, then Spain, and finally reached Portugal. From there, with American diplomatic help, they boarded a ship bound for the United States, eventually settling in Quebec, Canada. They lived in a small house near Lac Saint-Louis, far from Vienna, far from palaces, far from any memory that could hold itself together. But Zita carried every piece of the past in her satchel. She kept Charles's gloves in her dresser, his rosary under her pillow, a lock of his hair in a locket she kissed each night. She told Canadian bishops, "I am not a refugee. I am a widow of history, and I am still waiting for its return." She was 50, but seemed older. Her body stiffened, her mind hardened. She walked slowly, stared often, smiled rarely. But still, she refused to blink. She lived too long enough to see her enemies die of old age, long enough to watch the world forget the name Habsburg, long enough for the silence around her to become louder than any revolution, and long enough for even her children to question if she still saw what they could no longer imagine. Because the empire was not just gone, it was buried. Twice. Once in war, and once in memory. But Zita, she remained. By the 1950s, she had become a relic, not of nostalgia, but of unresolved weight. A black-veiled figure who appeared at weddings, funerals, and Catholic gatherings. Her presence carried gravitas, but no office, respect, but no relevance. She signed autographs for monarchists who had never seen a crown. She sent blessings to altars that had long since been turned into museums. She moved from country to country, never settling, always a guest, always temporary, a queen with no court, a pilgrim with no shrine. Her mind remained sharp, but rigid. She refused to speak of democracy, refused to acknowledge post-war Austria as legitimate, refused to call Otto anything other than Your Imperial Majesty. Even when Otto, weary and pragmatic, begged her to stop. "It makes us look delusional, Mother." She shook her head. "It is not we who are deluded. It is the world." Her health began to decline slowly, like a candle resisting wind. Her knees stiffened, her back curved, her eyesight faded. But her voice, thin, papery, unwavering, remained intact. She read every letter sent to her by monarchist circles, especially from Austria, France, and Hungary. She responded with care, with calligraphy, with scripture. When asked by a journalist in 1961 whether she still believed the empire would return, she replied, "I do not believe. I wait." In moments of solitude, she talked to Charles. Still. Every morning, every night, servants recalled her sitting for hours in front of a small portrait of him, eyes locked, unblinking, lips moving softly, repeating the same Latin prayer they used to say together as Emperor and Empress. They also recalled she often slept with a folded imperial flag beside her, wrapped in linen, pressed smooth, as if it might still be unfurled one day, over a crowd that remembered how to kneel. And yet, there were moments. Fleeting, gentle, almost human. She visited her daughter Elizabeth in Brussels, held her newborn grandson with trembling hands, whispered, "The empire lives," in small cries and closed fists. She walked once through a French meadow in spring, leaning on a cane. She paused near a flowering chestnut tree, eyes closed, listening to birdsong. When asked if she was praying, she smiled and said, "No, for once, I am only listening." That moment stayed with the nurse for the rest of her life. Then came 1962 and the offer. The Austrian government, for the first time in over 4 decades, allowed Zita to apply for entry. But only as a private citizen, not as empress, not as royalty, just as Zita Habsburg. She refused, not out of pride, but because acceptance would mean betrayal. It would mean signing the death certificate of something she had spent her life keeping on artificial life support. "I cannot walk on Austrian soil as a ghost," she said. "Not while my husband still breathes in memory, and my son has not abdicated." And so, she remained in exile, voluntarily, deliberately, even as Austria modernized, even as her contemporaries faded, even as Charles's name was gradually erased from textbooks and official records. In 1972, she suffered a fall. The injuries weren't serious, but her recovery was slow. Her legs never quite worked the same. She began using a wheelchair. Her voice cracked more often. But she still insisted on attending Mass, even when carried in. She still dressed every morning, corset and all. Still wore gloves. Still refused mirrors in her room. And, above all, she still refused to blink, even as cataracts clouded her vision, even as blindness took her slowly. She stopped reading, but continued writing, by memory, She dictated letters to her assistant in 3 languages, each ending the same way. From Her Imperial Majesty, the Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. By the 1980s, she was more myth than person. Young monarchists sought her out. Nuns brought school children to hear her speak. She said little, but when she spoke, it felt like something ancient was cracking through the present. "Never speak of monarchy as past," she once told a boy in Zurich. "Speak of it as a house under repair, not abandoned, never abandoned." In 1982, Austria quietly lifted the final ban. She was allowed to return, not as royalty, but as family. Zita, then 90 years old, accepted, but only for one purpose: to be buried beside her husband. She made the journey with Otto and her surviving children. Austrian officials received her with cool ceremony. No crowns, no titles, only caution. She walked slowly through Vienna, stared at the buildings she once ruled from, touched the gates of Schönbrunn, and said nothing, not a tear, not a word, only her presence and her silence, and the black, always the black. The woman who had once ruled the second largest empire in Europe was now just a figure in shadow. But she had outlived it all. The war, the revolution, the occupation, the exile, the century. Zita had become the last survivor of an extinct species, the imperial widow who never unclenched her hand from history's wrist. She died quietly, not with ceremony, not with headlines, not with the sound of trumpets or the clash of crowns, but with breath that slowed, then paused, then left, without a whisper. On March 14th, 1989, Empress Zita of Austria, widow of the last emperor, passed away at the age of 96 in a modest residence in Zeisers, Switzerland, surrounded not by servants or nobility, but by her children, her rosary, and the memory of a world that no longer existed. The moment her heart stopped, something else did too. Something unspoken. A tension, an expectation that had stretched across decades, silently asking, would she live long enough to see her crown restored? The answer came not with thunder, but with stillness. For 67 years, Zita had worn black. For 67 years, she had addressed herself as Empress. For 67 years, she had never once said goodbye to the man she called Majesty. And now, at last, she was ready. The news reached Vienna slowly. At first, it was just a headline, a name, a date. Then, gradually, the realization dawned. The last Empress of Austria was dead. No one quite knew what to do. She had not ruled for over 70 years. She had never been recognized by the Republic. She had never been pardoned, only tolerated. And yet, there was something undeniable in the air. A heaviness, an ache, a presence now gone that had somehow outlived the very soil it once claimed. Otto von Habsburg, her eldest son, now a seasoned politician and advocate for European unity, stepped forward with dignity, not just as a son, but as the last living link to the dynasty she had preserved with her silence. He announced that Zita would be laid to rest in Vienna, alongside her husband Emperor Charles I, in the imperial crypt of the Capuchin Church, where centuries of Habsburgs had been entombed beneath marble and candlelight. And with that, something unprecedented happened. The Austrian Republic agreed. They called it a funeral, but it felt like a procession for a ghost. Over 40,000 mourners came to pay their respects, some out of nostalgia, some out of reverence, some simply to witness the ending of something they didn't know still lingered. The coffin, draped in the imperial standard, was transported with military precision, not as a political statement, but as a bow to the past. She was given what she had always refused to relinquish: a royal farewell. The streets of Vienna stood silent as her body passed. Children watched from rooftops. Old men wept without knowing why. Tourists stopped to ask who she was. "The Empress," someone whispered. "The last one." And inside the Capuchin crypt, beneath stone arches and gilded names, Zita was finally laid beside Charles. Their coffins were aligned, crosses placed, candles lit. For the first time in nearly 7 decades, they were together again, not in memory, not in prayer, but in stillness. The ritual followed the old Habsburg tradition. At the crypt gate, a herald knocked and requested entry. A friar within asked, "Who seeks admission?" The herald replied with Zita's full titles: "Her Imperial and Royal Majesty, Zita Maria delle Grazie, Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia." The friar responded, "We do not know her." The herald knocked again, gave her virtues, her piety, her charity. "We do not know her." On the third knock, he simply said, "Zita, a mortal sinner." The gates opened, because in the house of the dead, only humility enters. It was more than ritual. It was the closing of a book few remembered still being written. Zita had outlived emperors, kings, dictators, wars, and entire ideologies. She had outlived palaces, crowns, titles, and nations. She had outlived her generation, and perhaps herself, and in doing so, she had become something more than royal. She had become symbol, not of power, but of endurance. The Vatican sent condolences. So did monarchist societies from across Europe. Flags flew at half-mast in parts of Hungary and Liechtenstein. In France, elderly legitimists lit candles. In Portugal, church bells rang. But the republics remained silent. Because how do you mourn someone who never acknowledged you? Otto wept quietly, not for a mother, but for the ending of a story he had spent his entire life holding open. He did not speak of crowns. He did not speak of thrones. He simply said, "She believed, longer than anyone else ever could." And yet, even in death, Zita's legacy refused to settle. Within months of her burial, calls began to rise among Catholic groups for her beatification. They cited her unwavering faith, her humility, her loyalty, her suffering. And in 2009, the process officially began. She may yet be declared a saint, from empress to exile, to widow, to myth, to memory, and perhaps to something holy. But in the Capuchin crypt, beneath the candlelight and the marble silence, her coffin remains. A box of oak, a plaque of brass, an empire buried in flesh and fabric. And above it, only a single name: Zita. No crown, no title, no fanfare, only the sound of silence, and a legacy that refused to blink. The crypt was sealed. The funeral procession disbanded. The black veils were folded and returned to their drawers. But Zita did not disappear. She had been silent in life. But in death, she echoed. Not as a headline, not as a symbol reclaimed by state banners, but as a question, a contradiction, a presence both too heavy to carry and too inconvenient to forget. Because Zita did not leave behind a clear legacy. She left behind a fracture between memory and myth, between faith and fanaticism, between what was true and what she insisted must remain true, no matter the world's refusal. In Vienna, historians debated what to make of her. To some, she was a stubborn royalist who clung to obsolete ideas, a woman who refused modernity, a mother who raised her children not for freedom, but for thrones that no longer stood, a widow who confused mourning with absolutism. To others, she was a pillar of dignity in a collapsing age, a woman who bore exile with composure, who kept faith when nations betrayed it, and who embodied a European order rooted not in power, but in purpose. They agreed on one thing. She was not ordinary. In Austria, her name was still politically sensitive. Republican institutions remained cautious. No public monuments, no schools named after her, no holidays declared. But quietly, softly, something began to shift. Younger generations, born long after the wars, began to rediscover her, not as queen, but as character. They found in her letters a kind of tragic poetry. In her black gowns, a kind of silent defiance. In her refusal to change, a haunting reminder that history never really ends. It only falls quiet, waiting to be retold. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, took notice. Zita's life was filled with the kind of suffering the Church canonizes: exile, widowhood, loss, sacrifice. She had lived nearly 100 years without scandal, without luxury, without vengeance. She had raised 8 children in poverty, prayed daily, forgave enemies, and never once expressed hatred for those who stole her throne. In 2009, the Diocese of Le Mans in France, where she had once lived, opened her cause for beatification. The process was long, rigorously documented. Interviews were conducted, her letters examined, her habits catalogued. She became known as Servant of God Zita. And while no miracles had yet been officially attributed, her spiritual legacy of endurance, faith, and forgiveness made her a rare figure in modern sainthood discussions. A monarch, yes, but one whose power had always been interior. But the question lingered: was Zita a saint? Or was she a woman who had mistaken power for piety? Critics argued that her refusal to renounce the empire had cost her children their peace, that she imposed roles they could not fulfill, that her refusal to acknowledge democratic realities made her a prisoner of her own creation. Supporters replied that it was precisely this refusal that made her heroic. In an age of betrayal, she remained loyal. In an era of cynicism, she remained devout. In a century that devoured its ideals, she held on to one and did not blink. And what of her children? Otto, once groomed to be emperor, became something entirely different. He renounced all dynastic claims, became a European Parliament member, spoke 6 languages, defended democracy, condemned fascism. He had seen 2 world wars, lost a father, carried his mother's burden, and still found the strength to walk a new path. But he never stopped calling her Majesty. And in interviews, even as an old man, his voice would crack when asked about her. She did not belong to the 20th century, he once said. She belonged to something older and something stronger. In monarchist circles across Europe, Zita became a kind of cult figure. Her face on candles, her quotes engraved on prayer cards, her likeness carried in processions in Belgium, Hungary, and parts of rural France. But these were not masses of political revival. They were personal acts of remembrance. People who had lost parents, homes, languages, found in Zita someone who had also lost everything, but still stood tall. And then there were the skeptics. They pointed to her silence during controversial periods, her failure to openly denounce fascist regimes, her apparent support of monarchist restoration, even when it endangered peace. They questioned her mental health in later years, her rituals, her repetition, her unwillingness to adapt. They saw not sainthood, but obsession. A woman who had built her identity around a role no longer written in the script of history. And yet, those same skeptics could not deny the impact, because Zita had done something few others ever could. She made loss look like loyalty. She made grief look like grace. She made irrelevance look sacred. Her image today is conflicted. She is not venerated like Elizabeth I, nor vilified like Marie Antoinette. She stands somewhere in between, half shadow, half statue. She is remembered not for what she did, but for what she refused to let die. And in that refusal, Zita of Bourbon-Parma became more than an empress. She became a test of how much the past can survive the future, of whether dignity still has a place in ruins, of how long a woman can hold the line when history has already moved on. There are moments when memory softens, when silence no longer screams, when grief, long settled into bone, gives way to something gentler. Not joy exactly, but peace. Zita never stopped grieving. But in her final decades, something shifted. Not in what she believed, but in how she carried it. The empire was gone, but her family had grown. The dynasty she once thought broken beyond repair had quietly taken root. Not in marble halls or royal decrees, but in gardens, classrooms, parliaments, and weddings. And in the soft light of her grandchildren's laughter, the widow of Austria sometimes allowed herself a kind of secret smile. She was surrounded by life. By the 1950s and 1960s, the children of her 8 offspring began to multiply. Scattered across Europe, some in titles, some in anonymity. They bore names like von Habsburg, de Bourbon, de Ligne, and d'Asburgo-Lorena, but also names given by schools and neighbors in Belgium, France, Luxembourg, and Canada. They spoke many languages. They lived without crowns. But they knew her story, and she, aged, dignified, always veiled in black, became more than an empress. She became a matriarch, not of a court, but of memory. The family gathered often, not in palaces, but in villas and monasteries. They would bring food, play music, read to her. She would sit silently, a warm blanket across her knees, listening. Sometimes she would speak. "Charles would have loved this," she'd whisper when a grandchild played Schubert on the piano. He always said the second movement of the trio sounded like home. They never asked what she meant by home, because everyone understood. For Zita, home had never been a place. It had been a time, a purpose, a man. She began telling stories, not of politics, not of thrones, but of mornings in Madeira, when Charles held their youngest child and walked barefoot through dew-soaked grass, of the sound of organ music echoing through the chapel of Schwarzau on their wedding day, of the way the roses bloomed just outside the window the year they lived in Quebec, the year the exile didn't feel so cold. Her voice when telling these things, softened, lost the steel, regained the silk. One of her daughters later said, "Mother was most herself when remembering, not the empire, but the moments in between." And then came Otto's triumph. After decades of advocacy, diplomacy, and personal sacrifice, Otto von Habsburg, the boy raised in the shadow of a lost throne, became one of the architects of modern Europe. He served in the European Parliament from 1979 to 1999, a champion of integration, peace, and transnational dialogue. In him, the dream Zita once held, the one that had seemed delusional, unreachable, almost dangerous, took a new form. Not as empire, but as unity. And Zita, though she never spoke publicly of politics after exile, knew. She followed his speeches, clipped his articles, kept a European Union flag folded next to the imperial one in her drawer. When a guest once asked which flag she preferred, she simply said, "One carries our past, the other protects our children. Both are sacred." Her final years, though marked by declining health, were filled with rituals of remembrance. She still lit candles, still prayed in Latin, still dressed each morning in mourning black, though her attendants noticed she sometimes added a brooch shaped like a lily or a ribbon of white lace under her collar. Small signs, small mercies. In 1982, when Zita was allowed to visit Austria again after 6 decades of banishment, it was not to reclaim, it was to reunite. She walked slowly through the streets of Vienna, her steps cautious, her eyes, blind in one, fading in the other, still searching. When she reached the gates of the Schönbrunn Palace, she paused, touched the iron bars. "It is smaller than I remember," she said, then smiled. "Or perhaps I was taller in those days." Her children wept quietly. That journey, though brief, left its mark, not just on Zita, but on the Austrians who saw her. Frail, veiled, royal, yet ordinary, standing before history as its last living echo. Not demanding, not pretending, just being. And in that moment, something in the national memory softened. Zita became less controversial, more human, not a threat to the Republic, but a chapter in its book. One of her granddaughters later described Zita as a lighthouse made of memory, fixed, silent, and impossible to ignore, no matter how far you sailed from shore. In her final winter, she received a gift, a small oil painting, not of a palace, not of an emperor, but of a child, barefoot, laughing, running through grass. The caption read, "Madeira, 1921. She looked at it for a long time, then whispered, "That was the last time we were truly free." And for a moment, just a moment, she blinked. Her story ends where all royal stories do. Not in glory, not in gold, but in silence. A silence shaped not by defeat, but by endurance. Empress Zita never reclaimed her throne. She never saw her husband canonized, nor her children return to palaces as rulers. She died in exile, buried beneath marble but surrounded by questions. Questions that outlived her body, questions that her stillness refused to answer. And maybe that is why we still look at her. Not because she won, not because she ruled, but because she refused to forget. Because in a world that asked her, again and again, to let go, she held on. To titles no one used, to rituals no one followed, to an empire no one remembered. She held on, long after it made sense. And in doing so, she forced us to ask, what is memory, if not the most defiant form of love? Zita's legacy does not lie in governance. She signed no great decrees, led no armies, fought no wars. Her battlefield was memory. Her weapon was discipline. Her throne, a prayer bench. Her scepter, a rosary. Her crown, a belief that never cracked, even as the world around her turned to ash. She was not a queen in exile. She was exile made queen, and yet she was more than symbol. She was mother, teacher, wife. She loved with a quiet fire, grieved with terrifying composure, spoke only when the silence became too sharp to carry alone. Her life stretched across centuries, from the last whispers of imperial Vienna to the divided Europe of post-war diplomacy. She lived through 2 world wars, the collapse of 7 monarchies, and the rise of a global order where her name meant almost nothing. And still, she did not look away. She watched. She remembered. She believed. There's something both tragic and holy in that, because belief, when separated from power, becomes something else, something deeper, more dangerous, more sacred. It becomes witness. Zita witnessed a world disappear, and she bore witness to that loss, not with rage, not with delusion, but with grace that hardened into ritual. She became, in time, the embodiment of what it meant to lose everything, and still live as if nothing had been taken. But what do we do with that? In an age that values adaptability, was her refusal to change strength or denial? Was her silence nobility or stubbornness? Was her black veil a symbol of eternal love, or of a mind that could not break free from grief? Some say she was a ghost who walked too long. Others, a saint who walked just far enough. I say she was a mirror held up not to history, but to ourselves. Because Zita forces us to confront what we would cling to when everything else has been stripped away. She asks, what remains of a person when the world forgets them? And more hauntingly, what if they refuse to forget the world? Even now, her name lingers in quiet places, in monastic halls, in family albums, in the yellowing margins of history books too narrow to hold her pain. But perhaps her true resting place is not in Vienna, not in the Capuchin crypt, not even in the prayers whispered by monarchists or the petitions sent to Rome. Perhaps her resting place is in the unspoken space between remembrance and forgetting, a space we all visit from time to time when we look at the past and wonder if it still looks back. And so, we leave her there, eyes open, mouth closed, still unblinking, a widow of a vanished world, a queen of nothing, and of everything we once thought eternal. Reflection, personal note, as I've walked with her through this story, through the cold mornings in Madeira, the dusty escape across Europe, the long evenings of silence in exile. I'm struck not just by her loyalty to empire, but by her refusal to let the idea of dignity rot in the face of humiliation. Zita was never fragile. She was flint. She did not bend. She endured. And whether we see that as faith or madness, I think it says something about us that we are still not sure. Because deep down, in a world where memory fades faster than attention spans, her story stands like a single candle, dim but unwilling to be snuffed out. And perhaps the final question is not whether she was right to believe, but whether we would have had the strength to believe that long in anything. So then, what would you refuse to forget, even if the world no longer remembers it with you?